The content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Altman, Flynn & Kubler, where we practice intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can check us out online and view all archived episodes of this show on our website at altmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. I have a very special guest. He's joining us on the phone this evening. His name is Professor Carlton Waterhouse. He was my old professor back when I was in law school at Florida International University. Professor Waterhouse has since moved on to Indiana University's law school, where he teaches property law as well as environmental law. He just recently returned from Beijing at the School of Business and Economics in Beijing, where he taught environmental law there for over the last month. Professor Waterhouse has quite an impressive record both in academia and in public service. He's also on the advisory board for the United States Civil Rights Commission. And this evening, however, we are going to be discussing President Obama's rollout of his recent climate change action plan, and we're going to get his thoughts and hopefully some of the insight into what's going to be happening with respect to environmental protection in the upcoming years. So, Professor Waterhouse, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Jeff. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So, if you could just maybe take us through what are the nuts and bolts of this plan that the president recently rolled out? What's it going to do, and who's it going to affect?
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff, for the opportunity to be on the show tonight. The plan that's been rolled out is the result of actually quite a few years of work by the EPA and other stakeholders. It really started when a court case was brought before the Supreme Court back in the 2000s, requiring them to regulate or to evaluate, rather, I should say, whether or not greenhouse gases cause an endangerment to the environment under the Clean Air Act. The Supreme Court made a finding in that case that there was standing for the state of Massachusetts and other parties to bring suit, and that EPA did have an obligation to test, to examine whether there was an endangerment that was posed by greenhouse gases to human health and the environment. Ultimately, EPA did that under the Obama administration, and they went further and began to roll out these regulatory rules on how now climate would be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Specifically, this is being addressed under Section 111D and B of the Clean Air Act. And what this rule does that's being released today is it gives a final rule after a year or more of a proposed rule being under consideration by the agency, and millions of comments being received by private citizens, academia, corporations, industry groups, as well as nonprofit organizations and governments, with regards to how we could address the impact of stationary sources on the impact on climate. And in that regard, the rule focuses on power plants as one of the major contributors to greenhouse gases, the largest single stationary source contributor to greenhouse gases in the United States. To do that, it basically looks to have plants to roll back the amount of carbon dioxide which they are responsible for emitting into the environment to levels that were actually in place back in 2005. So this is looking to then see that we don't have emissions levels coming out of our plants that are higher than what was coming out in 2005. And to that degree, the rule has an approach which is built around flexibility for the states to choose how they want to approach the issue. Ultimately, EPA has required that by 2013, roughly 15 years from now, those emissions should be rolled back, and that the performance in terms of the rate of emissions should be back to those earlier levels, which represents a substantial cut, maybe about 32% over what's happening in many places today.
Now, I think it's worth noting that although the plan intends to cut carbon emissions by 32%, that of course includes other greenhouse gases that are then put into what's called carbon equivalents. That includes nitrogen oxides as well as sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide, of course, is the principal component in acid rain, which is what the Clean Air Act was originally adopted for. The plan, of course, takes into consideration that acid rain and air pollution also cause major local environmental problems and can contribute to issues such as asthma and other health-related complications. And as a result, the plan intends to cut sulfur dioxide emissions by 90% and nitrogen oxides by 77%. So, in addition to the global component of cutting these carbon emissions, it also appears to take some action to reduce some of the more localized air pollution associated with these power plants.
That's an excellent point, and it's a point that the agency thought was very important in the process because it has very clear and direct effects on health and not just on climatary issues that we might have health effects flowing from, but asthma, missed days of school, missed days of work, and premature deaths, which result particularly from nitrous oxide.
Interesting. What are your thoughts on targeting specifically the power plant sector? That is, we're talking about coal plants that are used to generate electricity. Of course, they're going to be the principal targets, if you will, of this plan. But how about other sources of carbon pollution, such as automobiles?
Well, automobiles have actually been addressed earlier by EPA. That was the first step that they took after the endangerment finding, when the administration put more intense requirements on auto manufacturers. Under the Clean Air Act, it has two approaches. One is an approach to dealing with air pollutants from stationary sources. The other is an approach to deal with air pollutants coming from mobile sources. So they first went to address mobile sources, and that's primarily directed towards a more narrow industry, the auto industry, and setting standards on their fleet and what their fleets had to achieve in terms of miles per gallon and other emission standards for the upcoming years. Having gotten that in place and moving forward, having survived a court challenge as well, now the EPA turns its attention to stationary sources under the Act. And it makes sense that they went to power plants because they are the largest, by far, single contributor as a stationary source to greenhouse gas emissions.
And it appears, of course, that we're also going to be moving towards clean energy, such as solar and wind. We've increased, since Obama's taken office, wind energy has increased by threefold, and solar energy has been increased by 20-fold. And what I think is quite remarkable is that, especially with respect to solar energy, it's produced jobs at a rate of 10 times that of the rest of the economy. So that sort of puts a major hole in the argument that this clean energy sector is going to be killing jobs. It might actually create more jobs than are lost.
Right, and that's, to be honest, that's really the challenge. New technologies, when they are able to get in place, they actually have to in some cases, supplant existing technological mechanisms that are used. And so when there is a monopoly or an oligopoly in terms of those areas of technology, often those industries will put incentives in place or disincentives in place, from the adoption of those new technologies because they lose a relative position in the market. And so the idea of the loss of jobs and how, any environmental regulation in this regard is going to be bad for the economy is primarily an argument rooted around certain industries in that they may lose a certain share of the market, but that doesn't mean there won't be other industries that actually are able to create jobs and gain a share in the market. That's why I think it's important to consider that the way the plan was developed was to actually allow states to have flexibility in terms of what measures they would use in order to achieve the standards that the federal government put in place. So one approach would be for the states to actually focus their efforts around incentivizing and creating and using alternative energies through what's called the State Measures Plan. And through that, the state would basically potentially use renewable energy standards and programs to improve residential energy efficiency, as well as to have the federal standards in place as a backdrop in the event that the alternative energy uses and energy efficiency changes didn't reach the goal. But where the states can, through a mix of bringing online alternative energies, meet the standards, actually there's no requirement that they have to set more rigorous and more rigid standards on existing power plants because they are going to meet the goals through an increased use of alternative technologies and energy efficiency.
Well, what is some of that flexibility that you were talking about with the states? What exactly do they have the flexibility to do? I mean, they have, like there might be permit trading for emissions, possibly. Do they have the option of using, for example, a carbon tax as an alternative to permit trading?
Well, okay. So first, let me just take a moment and say a little bit about the kind of state, the plan, and then we'll talk about emissions trading if that's okay. So the way the states move forward is they can decide that they're going to reach the goals that the agency has put in place through this final rule through either focusing on kind of the emissions rate or a mass rate in terms of the approach that's used. Ultimately, what that means is that they can put specific emissions performance standards on their plants in their state. So they can take all of the coal-fired and natural gas-fired plants and put specific performance requirements on all of those plants as a way to reach the goal. So they can basically say, you have to reduce your emissions or you can't have these pollutants emitted above these levels. And they just go to each plant and put those in place for all your new plants under 111B. Under 111B, that deals with modified plants, and that deals with reconstructed plants. But that's a little different rule. So they basically take these requirements then that they have in place on these facilities, and they would set standards like we do with many already existing pollution limits. In the alternative, the state measures plan, as opposed to the emission standards plan I just articulated, allows states to say, instead of putting rigid requirements on each of the facilities, they basically say, well, we have the ability to kind of develop our own mix in terms of energy to reach the goal. And that would mean they can say, we can, instead of setting rigorous requirements on every facility, we can say we're going to increase the amount of solar energy that we have in the state and the amount of wind energy that we have in the state. And as a result, and even nuclear energy. And as a result of those changes, by increasing their contribution to the grid, we're going to effectively decrease the amount of carbon that's being produced, greenhouse gases like carbon that's being produced in the state, because they will have a smaller share of the total electricity generation that's taking place. So as a result of that, rather than setting limits on plants that are existing and emitting coal or natural gas, what they're doing is decreasing the amount of electricity that coal and natural gas will contribute to the grid, and in turn decreasing then the amount of greenhouse gases that those facilities will also be emitting into the environment. So that's where the flexibility comes in.
Now, where does this leave nuclear? Because this is a controversial topic, because there's always the fear of if a plant is compromised, we might have another 3 Mile Island or a major disaster. But if nuclear is going to be the most cost-effective option for power companies to use to replace coal, we might be seeing more of that under this plan.
That's actually true, and that, you know, from the standpoint of air pollution and from the standpoint of greenhouse gas emissions, nuclear energy is a safer approach to energy production. Now, from the standpoint of catastrophic risk, it's not as safe, and so there are other reasons why we might not want to go to nuclear. So nuclear energy could fare better, and there are some states that may have a bigger investment in nuclear energy, and they may use that as part of a mix by adopting the state measures plan as a way of reaching these goals. So it really is going to be on a state-by-state basis, but the rule gives the states flexibility to actually make that choice rather than the federal government actually being involved in deciding what role nuclear will have.
So it'll be interesting to see how each state chooses to implement this policy. It's going to be, my fear would be that there might be some states that push the envelope somewhat and possibly stonewall the president's efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions from states, let's say, whose governors or legislature is not sympathetic to this plan.
Oh yeah, that's we already know that's going to happen. I mean, in fact, there was already a meeting of one of the state legislatures groups where they have already decided and issued talking points to different legislative bodies across the country. This meeting took place in San Diego back in July, around the 24th, and they've already taken position, issued talking points to governors and state legislatures, saying this is how you can get on board to challenge and oppose the final rule that's been put in place.
The other thing that I think really should be part of the discussion here is the cost, because when we think of clean energy, we often think of it in the same context of anything that is labeled quote-unquote green, including organic food. And yes, generally organic food is more expensive than food that is produced with genetically modified organisms and the heavy use of pesticides. However, if you look back, let's say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when organic foods first hit the shelves on a wider scale, the cost has gone down quite dramatically. And that might happen here with solar and wind and other alternatives, is that as production with these alternative energy sources go up, the overall cost per unit might go down, and this might be much more affordable in the future than it is today.
I think that's absolutely right. You can look at any new technology, everything from cars to cell phones, and when they come out new and when it's an early developing product, that just has a much higher cost. Economies of scale allow, once mass production is put in place, for a lot cheaper costs associated with the technology. There's also the transition cost, right? Moving from the old system to the new system has its own cost in place. And so the challenge is to get us to make the investment. And after we make the investment, we will ultimately see, I think, these new technologies and a mix of energy production methods reward us. I'm just coming back from Beijing, though. I can tell you it's worth the cost. They have a serious air pollution problem. Now, that's not new because we had our own serious air pollution problem that led to the creation of the Clean Air Act and partially the EPA back in 1970. But you could see how their air pollution problem has also spurred them on to be one of the biggest producers of alternative energy sources. And so if we're looking at this in a long-term perspective, from an economic and not just from a short-term economic perspective, we could see how getting into the market of developing green and clean energy production is going to be something important in the global market. And right now, China is racing to become the number one producer in the solar arena, and likely to try to push to become the same in wind energy. And so this is an area we can get a competitive advantage if we go ahead and make these kind of investments now. We can be a big player in that, and American companies can be big beneficiaries as well.
You know, you mentioned China. One of the main criticisms of efforts to cut carbon emissions in the United States is that there is no corresponding way to make China or, let's say, other emerging economies such as India that have high populations from reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the obvious counter-argument to that would be like, since it's the entire planet is potentially imperiled by this, that would be like saying, if two people are on a lifeboat and one person pokes a hole on their side of the lifeboat, that the other person should respond by poking a hole in their side. Of course, we're all in it together, but there is a certain equitable argument or certainly a concern that China is just going to continue industrializing, and that the effects of climate change are going to be inevitable anyway.
Yeah, it's a good point. When you look at it, though, however, from an equity standpoint, from 1850 to 2007, the top emitters of pollution were the United States and China. However, the United States' contribution over that period of time is 28.8% of all global emissions, whereas China's is only 9%. So even though China and the U.S. are big players in the market, we're not, from an equitable standpoint, really at the same level. They still have a long way to go to reach the amount of carbon that we've actually ultimately put in the environment. Nonetheless, the president actually was very successful in reaching an agreement with China because they are the big player right now. They're responsible for 24% of all global carbon emissions. And China has agreed now that by 2030, they will increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption there to around 20% by 2030. And they are also going to reduce the total amount of carbon that they are emitting into the environment during that same time. So there are efforts that are going forward to make this a global response. And this effort by the EPA on mobile and now stationary sources allows America to, again, be a global leader in terms of addressing this major global international problem.
Now, is there, because, for example, with the Kyoto Protocol, there's a certain policy instrument there that's called joint implementation, where a developed country like the United States can potentially purchase offsets, or rather, polluters can purchase offsets in a developing or poorer nation, which has large forests that would otherwise be cut down, slash and burn. So there would be a means by which that you could offset the pollution here by preventing deforestation somewhere else. Is that going to be something that would be available with this plan?
Excellent point. And I should note, while the domestic policy that we've talked about does include emissions trading as a major part of it, allowing multiple states to actually work together towards meeting their targets, it's not clear yet whether the ultimate plan that folks are going to work on in December in Paris at the global level is going to include the same joint implementation mechanisms that were in Kyoto. I imagine it will, because they allow developing countries to reduce the actual amount of reduction that they have to do in their country, while at the same time investing in developing countries to prevent them from, either deforestation or from starting to pollute more carbon in the atmosphere. So hopefully that will be, because it kind of allows for cooperative approaches between the developing and the developed world. But they were minimally effective after Kyoto. So we can only hope that if they are in place, we'll see a greater level of use of them in the future.
And of course, the United States has not joined Kyoto yet. Do you see that happening anytime in the near future?
No, not really, because this new mechanism that's going to be put in place, hopefully that will be created and put in place coming out of Paris in December, is going to be really what is going to determine the future of climate change and whether or not we as a world are going to stop this from becoming an irreversible problem.
And what are your thoughts on, and we have a couple minutes left, the fact that President Obama has rolled out this plan? That he is in the 7th year of his administration, so it's kind of concerning since he came out with this pretty late in the game that if his successor isn't coming from the Democratic Party, that it could be repealed potentially.
That's true. However, typically when EPA has developed a rule and it's gone through a formal rulemaking process and it's actually survived a court challenge, it's very rare that a subsequent administration would actually come out and reverse or eliminate that rule. The reason being is that administrative agencies are supposed to be nonpartisan entities. Even though the administrators work for the president, the work that they do is supposed to be based on the law. And so under the Clean Air Act, there's a reasonable basis for this development of this rule. And if it survives a court challenge, it would be hard for the agency to justify, from a legal standpoint, technical standpoint, why they got rid of the rule. Just the fact that the president didn't like it doesn't really give a legitimate scientific or health basis to eliminate the rule. So if they get it through and they get it past a court challenge, it's likely that it's actually going to be here to stay.
We have less than a minute left. I was wondering if you had any parting thoughts, and where can people find out more about this plan?
Okay, so they could find out a lot more if they go to EPA's website, and they just can put in Clean Power Plan in a search engine, and that will take them to EPA's website, and there's a host of information, the rule itself, the history of the rule, and a number of documents that discuss the rule at a greater level of detail. My closing thoughts are just to thank you for having this conversation about such an important issue that all of us really need to be concerned about.
I think we lost you there, Professor. I'd like to give very special thanks to my guest, Professor Carlton Waterhouse from Indiana University School of Law. This is Jeff Van Treese for Talk Legal. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material of this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program